By the way, where'd you meet him? The Shangri-Las. First time I saw Keith, I must admit I didn't really take much notice, because he was sitting at the very back corner table in the shadows, and was, therefore, very difficult to see clearly, because he left before I could get close enough to take a good look, because he was with a woman, and even in the shadows, looked off limits. And because, to tell you the truth, I had already set my sights on somebody else. It was a Friday night. It would have made a perfectly hot August night of the Neil Diamond variety had it not been in July. It was after the third set. We were, at the time, playing 3 sets a night, Friday and Saturday nights at Tom Sawyer's, this perfectly claustrophobic little club down in Venice. We were me and the boys, my sometime backup band. The boys weren't strictly a band at all, let alone mine, just some freelancing musician Snooky managed to scrounge up when I decided one fine day that I needed a band. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce the boys. On drums, David, Mr. Moto Miyamoto, tall and thin as bamboo, third generation Japanese American, and a religious believer that Ginger Baker was God. On Fender bass and backup vocals, Jeff Bonomo, Bobo to his friends. Bobo was the official sex object of the outfit. He was Sal Mineo handsome, with Roger Daltrey's Tommy, the movie, physique, and his glands secreted a musk that magically moistened the lower labia of any healthy female specimen within a 2-mile radius. He broke an average of a heart an hour, as he was happily, faithfully married to a very sweet girl named Gina, with thick thighs, something of a mustache, and a way with linguini. Snooky had a long-standing, unrequited crush on the Bobo. Not me. I knew an incurable heterosexual when I saw one, or so I believed at the time. On guitar and backup vocals was one Steve Hicks, circa 1976. Somebody told Hicks that he looked like Peter Frampton, and Steve has been grinning and shaking his mane of long blonde hair like a blooming idiot ever since. The boy could play some guitar, though. And of course, there was Snooky on keyboards and backup vocals, and Little Me on lead vocals and heavy drama. As I've said, the boys, except for Snooks, weren't really my band, but times were hard, as always, for musicians. So when I lucked up on a paying gig, the boys did a pretty fair imitation of being mine. Tom Sawyer's just barely qualified as a paying gig. Just barely. Although the owners of Tom Sawyer's seemed to believe that they were running some cool, hip underground cellar full of noise, whose outward funkiness was part and parcel of its charm, Sawyer's was in reality what we in show business like to call a hole, whose outward funkiness was part and parcel of its overall funkiness. The atmosphere of Tom Sawyer's was disturbingly similar to that of a bat cave. As you may or may not remember, the summer of '79 was as hot and damp as 3 months in the steam room at the Y, though not nearly as much fun. And Tom Sawyer's was a tiny, cramped, darkly paneled room with no air conditioning and almost no light. I believe there were some rather exotic strains of mushroom growing in the corners. Also, no liquor license. Only domestic beer and some truly pedestrian wines were served at Sawyer's. There wasn't even a stage. Just a decrepit spinet piano in perpetual need of tuning, and a barely passable sound system. That the owners of Sawyer's should fancy the room a nightclub at all was the very height of presumption. That there were customers there at all was, to me, amazing beyond words. I was doing a rather eclectic act in those days. We did some originals, mostly Snooky's. He's a pretty good tunesmith, Snooky is. A song of his was getting some airplay on the new wave stations a couple of years ago. Hot, creamy monkey fucks. Maybe you've heard of it? We did some top 40, I Want You to Want Me by Cheap Trick and Blondie's Heart of Glass. Yeah, I know, but it was a very hot song at the time. And also just about anything else that tickled my highly ticklish fancy. Tonight, Tonight by the Mellow Kings, I Do Love Doo-Wop. Remember Walking in the Sand with the audience joining in on our final snaps, in on our finger snaps. Even the occasional obscure show tune, the Plastic Jesus song from Cool Hand Luke. We did some Elvis, some Motown, a bit of Bacharach and David, you name it. I even encored with Lydia the Tattooed Lady for a while. We threw together some pretty interesting sets in those days, let me tell you. For the record, we never once played My Sharona. I rather liked it, but Moto wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot drumstick, or anything by the Bee Gees, by unanimous decision. Sawyer's has long since gone the way of all flesh. It has since been a 4-square fundamentalist church, a lesbian cruise bar, and a Scientology center, among other things. And except that there are so few clubs of any caliber in this town where somebody as difficult to pigeonhole as I am can play, I'd say good riddance and no regrets. As far as I was concerned, Sawyer's only selling point was that it was there at all, a place to do what I do where such venues were too scarce. And then there was Louis. He was Sawyer's one and only busboy. Blond, buzz cut, maybe 19. Tan the color of Kraft caramels, with a mouth full and red and pretty as a girl's, lips that absolutely begged to be kissed, and one of the highest, roundest, most firmly packed little keisters I've ever seen on a white boy, before or since. The beauty of Louis's buns, stuffed into a pair of faded 501s, could heal the sick, give eyesight to the blind, and make the lame take up their beds and walk. In short, ladies and germs, this was one extremely beautiful boy, and, not incidentally, quite my personal cup.